The early summer sun was a judgment delivered without mercy upon Juniper Flats. It bleached the sky to a pale, aching white and hammered the alkali soil into a cracked mosaic. Heat shimmered in waves thick enough to be seen, distorting the horizon, making the distant, iron-dark mesas look as if they were melting into the sky. There was no wind, only the oppressive weight of the silence, broken by the dry electric rasp of cicadas hidden in the sparse greasewood. Kestrel Ridge Ranch was a scar in this landscape, a collection of low, sun-blasted buildings huddled around the skeletal tower of a windmill. Its fences were old, the split-rail timbers silvered by time and neglect. It was over one of these broken rails that the figure came. She didn't run. Running was a luxury of strength, and strength had bled out of her miles back. She scrambled, fell, and dragged herself over the splintered wood, landing in a heap in the dust on the ranch side. The movement was animalistic, driven by a primal terror that had long since burned through coherent thought. She was a thing made of torn calico, matted hair, and desperation. She tried to rise, to push herself toward the shade of the barn, but her legs folded. A sound, half sob, half groan, tore from her throat, dry as the dust she had collapsed in. In the relative cool of the barn's wide entryway, Cade Voss stilled his hands. The scent of harness leather and dry hay hung heavy around him. He was a man built of quiet angles, broad in the shoulder but lean, his movements economical. The sun had weathered his face, etching lines around his eyes that spoke of solitude rather than humor. He was stitching a broken rein, the waxed thread pulling tight with a small, satisfying zip. Then he heard it, the groan. It wasn't a coyote, it wasn't a calf, it was human. His body tensed, not in fear, but in a deep, weary caution. Trouble in Juniper Flats always rode in on horseback, loud and drunk. It didn't crawl over fences. He set the rein and his awl down on a hay bale, his hand moving not to the pistol holstered low on his hip, but simply resting near it, a gesture of habit. He moved from the barn's shadow into the blinding glare of the yard, his eyes narrowing against the light. He saw her immediately, a bundle of rags against his fence line. He moved slowly, his boots making no sound in the thick dust. He wasn't assessing her as a woman. He was assessing her as a situation. As he drew closer, the details resolved themselves with brutal clarity. She was young, perhaps 20. Her hair, the color of damp straw, was a tangled nest of twigs, burrs, and dried mud. The smell that rose from her was acrid old sweat, profound fear, and the metallic tang of blood. She had pushed herself onto her hands and knees, her head hanging. Her feet were bare. They were hamburger, raw and pulped, pierced by thorns and sharp alkali stones. Her dress was ripped at the shoulder, but it was her wrists that held his gaze. They were raw, circled by deep, weeping abrasions where rope had bitten down to the flesh. She was trembling violently, the tremors running through her like a wind-struck reed. This was Laura Benton. Though he didn't know her name, he knew her circumstance. He knew the shape of violence. Cade Voss had buried a wife and, in the years since, had buried most of his inclination for company. He was a man who preferred the logic of livestock and the honesty of leather. He spoke little because the land demanded little in the way of conversation. Now, he acted with that same silent practicality. He turned back to the porch, grabbed the heavy sheepskin coat he kept for cold mornings, and returned to her. She flinched as his shadow fell over her, scrambling backward and crying out, a pathetic, terrified sound. He stopped, holding the coat out. He said nothing. He simply waited. Her eyes, wide and frantic, met his. She saw a man whose face was closed, unreadable. He wasn't smiling, but he wasn't threatening, either. He was just waiting. Slowly, agonizingly, she stopped moving. He took one step, draped the heavy coat over her shaking shoulders, covering the torn dress, the raw skin. The weight of it seemed to anchor her, without a word. He bent, slid one arm beneath her knees and the other behind her back, and lifted her. She weighed almost nothing. She stiffened in his arms, a rigid line of terror, but she was too weak to fight. He carried her to the long, shaded porch that fronted the ranch house, setting her down gently on a wooden bench, her back against the rough-hewn wall of the house. She immediately curled in on herself, pulling the coat tight, her eyes darting from his face to the open expanse of the flats she had just crossed. Cade turned to the large earthenware olla resting in the shade. He dipped a tin cup into the cool water within and held it out to her. She stared at the cup as if it were a snake. He didn't push it. He set it on the porch floor beside her, then retreated to the far end of the heian, leaning his shoulder against a support post. He gave her space. He gave her silence. Laura Benton watched him, her breath hitching. Every man was a threat. Every kindness was a trap. She knew this. The last 24 hours had been a lesson carved into her skin. She had fled in the dead of night, slipping the knot that bound her to a chair while her stepfather, Silas Kern, celebrated the deal he'd made. Silas, a man of weak smiles and weaker whiskey, had gambled away everything, including her. The payment for his debts was Laura herself, handed over to Harlan Pike. Pike was a brute, a man whose presence was an assault, all sweat, tobacco, and casual cruelty. He had looked at her not as a person, but as livestock he had just purchased. The marriage was to be a formality conducted by a drunk justice in a back room, a piece of paper to make the possession legal. She had run. She had run until her boots fell apart, and then she had run on her bare feet, the jagged terrain tearing her, the sun trying to erase her. Now this man, he was quiet. Harlan Pike was noise. This man was still. He didn't approach. He didn't speak. He just watched. Her thirst was a fire in her throat. She looked at the tin cup. It was water. It was life. Her hand, shaking so badly she could barely control it, darted out. She grabbed the cup, spilling half the water, and brought it to her lips, gulping it down. It was cool and sweet, and it hit her empty stomach like a stone. She coughed, choking, but gripped the cup for more. A sudden gust of wind, hot and dry, swept across the yard, rattling the tin roof of the barn. It struck the windmill, and the blades turned with a long, metallic shriek. The rusted nails in the porch board seemed to creak in time with it, a rhythmic, agonizing sound, like a clock counting down. Counting down to what? To Harlan. He would be looking for her. He was not a man to let his property go. Cade watched her drain the cup. He pushed off the post, took the cup from her unresisting hand, refilled it, and set it back down. He returned to his post. He had seen the marks on her wrists. He had seen her feet. He didn't need the story. He kept his voice low, rough from disuse. You meaning to stay here till you can walk? The question startled her. It wasn't, what happened, or who are you? It was a practical question. More than that, it was a choice. It wasn't an order. It wasn't an offer of rescue. It was a statement of boundaries. He was giving her the agency that had been stolen from her. Laura's throat was too raw to form words. She looked from his impassive face to the endless, hostile line of the horizon. That horizon was where Harlan Pike and Silas Kern were. They were out there, gathering their rage, saddling their horses. The fear was so potent it had a taste, like old pennies. She could almost hear the hoofbeats, a dull thunder beneath the shriek of the windmill. She looked back at Cade. She gave a single jerky nod. He nodded once, as if settling a business arrangement. High above, two shadows wheeled against the white-hot sky, turkey vultures, patient and silent, riding the thermals. They were the arbiters of this land, circling the living, the dying, and the ghosts of the past. This country was always choosing sides, and it rarely sided with the weak. Cade turned and went into the house. Laura's heart leaped into her throat. He was leaving her. Or was he getting a gun? Was this the trap? He emerged a moment later. He carried a roll of clean cloth bandages, a gray cotton work shirt that was worn but clean, and a small, sharp-looking utility knife with a wooden handle. He did not approach her. He did not offer to tend her wounds. To do so would be to assume a right, to touch without asking. Instead, he walked to a small, three-legged stool near her bench and set the items down, all of them within her reach: the bandages for her feet and wrists, the shirt to replace her torn dress. And the knife? It was a tool. It was for cutting the bandages. It was, perhaps, for cutting away the last remaining fibers of the ropes that had bound her. But it was also a weapon. By placing it there, he was giving her the means to care for herself, and perhaps the means to defend herself, even against him. It was the first true act of respect she had known in months. Laura stared at the items. Cade Voss turned away, giving her his back. He walked to the edge of the porch, picked up the rein he had abandoned, and sat down on the top step, his focus returning to the broken leather. He was a quiet, solid shape against the unforgiving glare of the desert, a man who understood that sometimes the greatest kindness was to keep your distance. The sun bled toward the horizon, and the oppressive white heat of the day finally began to break. Softening into shades of bruised purple and blood orange, the air grew cooler, and the shadows of the porch posts stretched long and thin, striping the yard like prison bars. Cade Voss finished the last stitch on the rein. The leather was whole again. He tested the strength of it, pulling hard, and nodded once, satisfied. He'd been sitting on the porch step for over an hour, a silent sentinel, giving the woman on the bench time. He had heard the small, sharp sounds, the rip of cloth, the quiet hiss of her breath as she tended her wounds. He had not looked, not once. Now he stood. The movement was fluid, and Laura, who had been watching him through her matted hair, flinched. He didn't approach her. He stopped at the open doorway of the main house and leaned against the frame. "Sun's dropping," he said. His voice was a low rumble, like stones shifting. "You can't stay on the porch. It gets cold, and the coyotes get bold." Laura's hands, now crudely wrapped in strips of cloth, clenched in the lap of the oversized shirt. "You can come inside," he continued, his tone flat, stating a fact, not making an invitation. "But my house has rules." She tensed, her gaze dropping to the floorboards. Rules were how this had all started. Rules were what men made to trap women. "Just 3, he said, as if sensing her fear. "First, the door to the house ain't locked, not till full dark, and not from the outside. You're not a prisoner here. You come, you go. That's your choice." She looked up, confused. This was not the kind of rule she expected. "Second," he went on, gesturing with his chin toward the interior. "My weapons. The rifle stays on the wall rack. My sidearm." He tapped the holster on his hip. "Stays on me. They're mine. You don't touch them. And I won't have cause to use them near you. They're tools, nothing more. And third," he paused, and his gaze, which had been fixed on the yard, finally settled on her. His eyes were a pale, clear gray, hard to read as the sky. "Here, no is a complete answer. It means no. It don't need explaining. Not from you, not from me. It's respected, understood." Laura stared at him, her entire life. No had been a challenge, a negotiation, or a signal for violence to begin. The idea of no as a final word, an unbreakable wall, was as foreign as a different language. She could only nod, her throat too tight to speak. "All right, then." He turned and disappeared into the gloom of the house. She was left alone again with the creaking windmill. She looked at her feet, now swaddled in bandages. She had used the knife he left, her hands shaking so violently she had almost dropped it. She had cut strips from the hem of her own ruined calico dress to bind her wrists, then used the clean cloths he'd provided for her feet. The pain was a dull, hot throb, but the bleeding had mostly stopped. Then, she had changed. The act of pulling off her torn, filthy dress was a misery, her skin crawling with the memory of Harlan Pike's hands on the fabric, She had pulled Cade's gray work shirt on. It was huge, hanging on her like a canvas sack. But it was thick and clean. It smelled of lye soap, faint wood smoke, and a clean, masculine scent of sun-baked cotton. It smelled safe. She had buttoned it all the way to the collar, a high, choking defense. Each button sliding through its hole was an act of reclamation, a small piece of armor she was putting back in place. The sound of a stove lid clinking on cast iron came from the house. A few moments later, the sharp, welcome smell of coffee brewing cut through the dust. Cade reappeared in the doorway. Food. He didn't wait to see if she followed. He just went back inside. Laura pulled herself to her feet, wincing as her wrapped feet took her weight. Each step to the door was an agony, but she moved. To refuse would be to reject the truce. She limped into the house. It was sparse, clean, and dominated by function. A plain wooden table, scrubbed nearly white, sat in the center of the main room, which served as kitchen and living space. A stone hearth was cold, but a cast-iron stove in the corner radiated a low warmth. There were 2 tin plates on the table. On each sat a thick golden slab of cornbread. 2 mugs of steaming black coffee sat beside them. Cade was already seated. He gestured to the other chair. She sat. The silence was as thick and heavy as a wool blanket. It wasn't the awkward, brittle silence of polite company. It was the deep, measured silence of 2 people who understood that words were often dangerous and rarely necessary. It was a ceasefire. Laura picked up the bread. She was starving, but she forced herself to eat slowly, breaking off small pieces. The cornbread was coarse and unsweetened, with a smoky crust, but it was the best thing she had ever tasted. The coffee was scalding, bitter, and strong. It burned a path down to her stomach and sent a jolt of life through her exhausted body. They ate without speaking, the only sounds the clink of the tin mugs on the wooden table. Cade finished his bread and leaned back, nursing his coffee. He didn't stare at her, but his presence was absolute. He wasn't demanding anything. He was just there, waiting. The small act of kindness, the water, the shirt, this simple meal given without a single leering look or loaded question, cracked the wall of her terror. My stepfather, she whispered. Her voice was a dry croak. Cade didn't look up, but his hands, calloused and scarred, stilled around his mug. He was listening. Silas Kern. He gambles, the words came out haltingly, in broken pieces, as if she were pulling shards of glass from her throat. He lost everything, the feed store, the wagon, all of it. She stopped, breathing hard, staring into the black liquid in her mug. Harlan Pike, he held the debt. The name was Venom, and she spat it out. Silas, he didn't have any money left, so she couldn't say it. The shame was a physical weight, pressing on her chest, suffocating her. So he offered you as collateral, Cade said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement, delivered in that same flat, factual tone. Laura flinched at the brutal accuracy of the word, then gave a sharp, broken nod. Tears she hadn't been able to shed in fear now welled up in shame. He called it a marriage, a dowry to clear the books. She wiped her eyes angrily with the back of her bandaged hand. Harlan, he laughed. He said he'd take the payment. They were drinking, celebrating. Harlan grabbed me. He said it was time to seal the bargain. I hit him with the bottle, and I ran. The story was out, ugly and fragmented, laid bare on the table between them. She waited for the inevitable judgment. What were you doing alone with them? Why did you let him gamble? A woman has to be smarter than that. Cade was quiet for a long time. He drank the last of his coffee, the sound loud in the still room. He set the mug down with a decisive thud. He finally looked at her, his gray eyes meeting her terrified ones. He offered no pity. Pity was a weak, useless thing. He didn't offer comfort. He just held her gaze, and in that long, unwavering look, he said everything she needed to hear. His silence was not empty. It was full of recognition. He was a survivor. He knew the look of one. His stillness wasn't indifference. It was a profound, unspoken statement. I believe you. The fault is not yours. The tension in the room, stretched taut as a bowstring, was shattered by a new sound. Hoofbeats. Distant, but clear in the cooling air. Not a single horse, but two, maybe three, and they were moving fast. Laura went rigid. The mug slipped from her grasp, spilling hot coffee across the table. A choked, terrified sound escaped her. No. Oh, God, no. She scrambled back, her chair scraping loudly on the floor. Her eyes, wide and frantic, darted to the door, to the windows. She was a cornered animal, looking for an escape that wasn't there. He's found me. It's over. Cade was on his feet in one smooth, economical motion. There was no panic in him, only a sudden, cold readiness. Stay inside, he commanded. His voice was low, sharp, and absolute. And stay away from the door. He didn't run. He walked with deliberate speed onto the porch, planting himself in the center, a dark, solid silhouette against the twilight. He put one hand flat on the porch railing, his body language claiming the space as his. He made himself visible. Critically, his other hand rested on his thigh, inches from his holstered pistol, but not on it. To draw a weapon was to invite a fight. To stand empty-handed was to invite being run down. This was the middle ground, the posture of a man who would not start a conflict, but was entirely prepared to finish one. Laura, disobeying his order, had crawled into the deep shadows of the kitchen, peering through the open doorway. Her heart hammered against her ribs so hard she thought it might break. Please, please, just let him pass. Don't let him see me. The hoofbeats thundered closer, pounding the dry earth. A cloud of dust, visible even in the dim light, rose from the trail. She could hear the jingle of harness, the snort of a hard-ridden horse. Cade squinted, his body perfectly still. The riders burst into view. Two dark shapes on horseback. They were pushing hard, and they kept going. They didn't slow. They didn't turn toward the ranch's side path. They stayed on the main trail that cut past Kestrel Ridge. One of the riders, seeing the figure on the porch, lifted a hand in a brief, tired wave. "Mail," Cade called out, his voice carrying easily. "Evenin'," the rider shouted back, not slowing his pace. And then they were gone, vanishing into the growing darkness, their hoofbeats fading, leaving only a settling cloud of dust behind them. The silence that rushed back in was deafening. Laura sagged against the doorframe, the strength leaving her legs in a rush. The adrenaline drained away, leaving her shaking, cold, and nauseous. Cade remained on the porch for another full minute, his eyes tracking the dust cloud until it was gone. He took a long, slow breath, the tension visibly leaving his shoulders. He turned and came back inside. He looked at her, a trembling bundle of his own shirt in the shadows. "Just the mail rider," he said quietly. "He's running late." Night fell completely. The air in the house grew cold. The false alarm had shattered Laura's last, fragile reserve of strength. She couldn't go back out there. The darkness was no longer a shield. It was a hunting ground, and she was the prey. "Mr. Voss," she whispered, her voice trembling. I can't. Not tonight. I can't go back out there." She gestured hopelessly at the black square of the open door. "Please, I can sleep in the barn, in the hay. I won't be any trouble." He looked at her, then at the barn, then back. "Hay's full of mites," he said. "And rats." He turned, picked up a lantern from a hook by the door, and struck a match. The yellow light flared, pushing the shadows back. "Come on." He led her out of the house, not to the main barn, but to a small, windowless, sturdy-looking outbuilding set nearby, the grain storehouse. He pulled the heavy wooden door open. The smell that wafted out was clean and dry oats, milled wood, and a faint trace of cedar. It was not a bedroom, but it was solid. It was safe. In the corner sat a simple folded cot. With a sharp snap of his wrists, he unfolded it. He went to a large, sealed wooden chest, opened it, and pulled out 2 thick, clean wool blankets. He tossed them onto the cot. "This'll do," he said. He placed the lantern on a small, upturned crate beside the cot. "It's clean, and the bar is on the inside of the door." He looked at her. "The well is by the porch if you need water. I'm in the main house. I'm a light sleeper." He turned to leave, his hand on the door. He paused, as if remembering something. He reached into the deep pocket of his worn coat and pulled out a small, brass handbell, the kind a schoolteacher might use. He set it on the crate next to the lantern. Laura stared at it, uncomprehending. "You get in trouble," Cade said, his voice rough. "You hear anything you don't like, anything at all. You ring that, you ring it hard. I'll hear it." This, more than the water, the food, or the shirt, broke her. It was a lifeline. It was a promise. It was trust, given a voice. He was at the door, a tall shadow in the lantern light, about to pull it shut and leave her to her privacy. "Mr. Voss." He stopped, half-turned. "I can work," she said, the words tumbling out in a desperate rush. She had to make this clear. This could not be charity. Charity was just another kind of debt, and debt was a chain. "I'm strong. I can mend. I can cook. I'll pay you back. For the food. For this." She didn't want to be an obligation. She would not be a burden. Cade looked at her for a long moment. The lantern light carved deep shadows under his cheekbones, making his face look like a mask of granite. She thought she saw a flicker of something, not sadness, but a deep, weary recognition. "You don't owe me for water," he said, his voice low, "and you don't owe me for a safe place to stand." He shifted his weight, ready to go. "Tomorrow," he said, "if you're still here and you choose to work, you can work because you want to. Laura." He knew her name. She didn't know how, but he knew it. "No," he finished, his voice firm, "because you're in my debt." He pulled the heavy door shut, leaving her in the clean-smelling dark, with the lantern, the blankets, and the bell. The sound of the heavy wooden bar sliding into place on her side of the door was the first safe breath she had taken in a year. Laura Benton woke to a silence that felt different. It was not the suffocating, watchful silence of the night before, filled with the memory of pursuit. This was a clean, thin silence, a temporary peace before the sun began its daily assault. She had slept on the cot in the grain storehouse, the heavy wooden bar secure in its brackets on her side of the door. She had slept in a way she hadn't in months, a deep, exhausted plunge into oblivion, her hand resting on the small brass bell Cade Voss had left her. She rose, her body screaming in protest. Her feet were twin universes of pain. The bandages stained, but the wounds were clean. Her wrists were a raw, angry red. She pulled Cade's oversized shirt tight around her, a shield of gray cotton. Outside, the world was painfully bright. She could hear the thunk, thunk, thunk of an axe splitting wood, a steady, domestic rhythm. Cade was already at work, his back to her, by the woodpile. A tin mug of coffee steamed on a nearby stump. She stepped out of the shed, feeling exposed, a trespasser. "Mr. Voss." He stopped, the axe held in mid-swing. He nodded, a simple acknowledgement. "Morning," he gestured with his chin. "Coffee's on the stove. Bread's in the tin." It was an offering of routine, a permission to exist. She was about to limp toward the house, to accept this fragile truce, when the sound began. It was what she had dreaded, hoofbeats. Her blood went cold, turning to slush in her veins. This wasn't the passing rush of the mail rider. This was slower, more deliberate, and it was coming up the ranch path. Cade set the axe down. He didn't look worried. He looked annoyed, like a man interrupted. He wiped his hands on his trousers and picked up his coffee. Laura froze, her gaze locked on the trail. 2 riders. One was a big man, slumped in the saddle, his movements jerky and uncontrolled. Even from a distance, she recognized the shape of him. Harlan Pike. The other man sat tall, his horse steady. He wore a dun-colored coat and a flat-brimmed hat. The morning sun caught a small, dull piece of metal on his chest. A tin star. The law. Laura. Cade's voice was low, cutting through her panic. Go back in the shed. Bar the door. This ain't your concern. But it was. She couldn't move. She was transfixed by the sight of her nightmare riding into this place of safety. The riders pulled up 20 yards from the porch. The marshal, an older man with a weary face and a thick, graying mustache, dismounted slowly. Harlan Pike nearly fell from his horse, catching himself on the saddle horn. A wave of stale, acrid odor rolled off him, the unmistakable, sour breath of the Copper Lily Saloon. He was drunk, and he was furious. Cade Voss didn't move from the porch. He stood by the post, holding his coffee mug, radiating a calm that felt more dangerous than any weapon. Marshal, Cade said, his voice flat, a nod of recognition. Cade. The marshal's eyes were heavy. He looked tired of this day before it had even begun. This is Bram Holloway. We got a complaint. I see that, Cade said. Harlan staggered forward, his face a mask of mottled red. He pointed a shaking finger, not at Cade, but past him, at the dark outline of Laura, frozen by the shed. There she is, he bellowed, his voice cracking. Voss, you godless thief, I'm here for my wife. The word hit Laura like a physical blow. Wife? It was a brand, a claim of ownership. That's a strong word. Pike, Bram Holloway said, his voice a dry rasp of authority. He didn't look at Laura. He looked at Harlan. A wife is a legal matter. You come to me this morning claiming theft of a spouse. So, show me. Where are the papers? Harlan, who had been building up to a charge, stopped short. What? The papers, Bram repeated, his patience already wearing thin as twine. A marriage certificate, a license, signed by a circuit judge, a name in a preacher's Bible. You show me a legal document that says this woman belongs to you, and we can have a conversation. You got one. Harlan sputtered, his drunken bravado collapsing into bluster. I got a contract. I got an agreement with Silas Kern. He gave her to me, fair and square, to settle his debts. You ask him. Silas Kern ain't here, Bram said, stepping calmly between Harlan and the porch. And I'm not asking Silas Kern. I'm asking you. You got a bill of sale for a human being. It ain't a bill of sale. It's a dowry. It's an arrangement. It's nothing, Bram said. It's talk. It's whiskey talk from the Lily. That ain't law. Harlan, not in this territory. She's mine, Harlan roared, his frustration boiling over. He lunged past the marshal, pointing directly at Laura. You tell him, Laura. You tell him you're my wife. You tell him what was agreed. All three men looked at her. This was the moment. The grain shed was safety. The house was safety. But out here, in the open yard, was the truth. Cade had given her a rule. No is a complete answer. She wondered if it held true against a man like Pike. She forced her legs to move. She limped, slowly, from the shadow of the shed, across the few feet of open ground, and mounted the first step of the porch. She stood beside Cade. Though not touching him, she was bandaged, dirty, and wearing a man's shirt, but she was standing on her own feet. She looked at Harlan Pike, and for the first time, her terror was eclipsed by a cold, clear rage. Her voice was a hoarse whisper, but in the morning stillness, it carried like a gunshot. There was no agreement. Pike? Harlan's face went slack with shock. There was no contract I signed, Laura continued, her voice gaining a fraction of strength. There was no preacher. There was no vow. She lifted her bandaged wrists, a mute testimony. There was only force. There was only a bottle of whiskey, and a rope you used to tie me to a chair. The accusation hung in the dead air. Cade went still, his eyes hardening as he looked at Pike. Bram Holloway's face darkened. He had heard enough. You "You lying harlot!" Harlan shrieked, the truth sending him into a blind rage. He lunged for the porch steps. Cade didn't draw his gun. He simply moved. He dropped his cup, stepped in front of Laura, and met Harlan's charge with a single, hard shove to the chest. It was not a punch. It was a blunt, powerful dismissal. Harlan, unbalanced and drunk, tumbled backward, landing in a heap in the alkali dust. He sputtered, choking on dirt and humiliation. "That's enough." Cade's voice was deadly quiet. Bram Holloway's hand was suddenly resting on the butt of his pistol. "Harlan, stay down." He walked over and stood above the gasping man. His voice was no longer tired. It was cold steel. "I've seen some low things, Pike, but this is a new chapter. In Juniper Flats. Women are not livestock. They are not collateral for a gambling debt. They are not property." He leaned down, his face close to Pike's. "Not while I wear this star. This woman says no. That's the end of it." Harlan pushed himself up, his face a mask of dirt and spittle. He was beaten, but his hatred was a living thing. He pointed a shaking finger, not at Bram, but at Cade. "This ain't over. Voss, you hear me? This ain't over. I'll be back. I'll get Silas, and I'll get the whole town. We'll see how proud you are, hiding another man's legal wife. We'll see what the town thinks of you." "That's the last warning you get," Bram said, his voice flat. "You're on private land. You're disturbing the peace. And frankly, you smell awful. Get on your horse and get off Kestrel Ridge. You ride back here without a court order. I'll put you in the drunk tank for a month. Am I clear?" Harlan scrambled to his feet. He looked at Cade's unmoving form, at Bram's hand on his gun, and at Laura's steady, accusing gaze. He was defeated. He ripped his horse's reins free and clawed his way into the saddle. "You'll pay for this. Voss, both of you." He kicked his horse savagely, wheeling it around, and galloped down the trail, a receding cloud of angry dust and curses. Bram Holloway watched him go, his expression one of profound disgust. He waited until Pike was a dot on the horizon before he finally let out a long breath and turned around. He retrieved his hat from the dust, slapped it against his thigh, and looked at Cade. "My apologies for the early call, Cade. You were just doing your job." "Bram," Cade said. He looked at Laura, who was trembling now that the danger had passed. "Go inside. Laura, get that coffee. It's safe." She looked at him, then at the marshal, and nodded. She disappeared into the house, but she didn't go far. She stood in the shadows of the kitchen, by the open window, her hands gripping the counter. Bram walked his horse to the water trough. "She telling the truth?" "The ropes." "The marks on her wrists say she is," Cade said quietly. Bram nodded, his face grim. "Figured. Pike's got a mean streak. But Silas Kern, that man would sell his own mother for a poker chip." He let his horse drink. "Cade, I didn't just come out here to chaperone that drunken fool." The tone shifted. It became the quiet, serious talk of two men who had known each other a long time. They had served together, seen the worst of things, and spoke a language of shared history. "I was at the Copper Lily late last night," Bram said, lowering his voice. Laura strained to hear. "Silas was in there. He wasn't just talking to Pike." Cade stiffened. "Who else?" "He's been making noise about his misfortune, about how he was cheated, and he's been talking about this land, specifically about your water." Laura's stomach tightened. "It's the driest start to a summer in memory," Bram continued, his voice a low rumble. "The creek's running low, but your spring, the Wellman Spring, it's always high. It's the only sure water in this section." "It's on my deed," Cade said, "sealed and filed." "A deed is just a piece of paper," Bram countered. "Silas is desperate, and desperate men find associates. He's been seen talking to the Sand Mesa Riders." The name hung in the air, cold and sharp. The Sand Mesa Riders weren't just drunkards like Pike. They were hard men who moved outside the law, who understood how to make things disappear. "They don't care about the girl," Bram said. "But Silas is painting a new picture. He's telling them you're a squatter, that your claim on the Wellman Spring is weak, that he has an older claim through his wife's family. It's a lie, Cade stated. It doesn't matter if it's a lie, Cade. It matters if they can make a judge believe it, or if they can scare you off it. Now, you're harboring a runaway woman. It makes you look unstable. It gives them leverage. Laura pressed her hand to her mouth. It was her fault. She had brought this. She wasn't just a refugee. She was a weapon being used against the one man who had helped her. His trouble was now deeper, and she was the anchor. So you watch your back, Bram said, gathering his reins. Pike is a loudmouth. The San Mesa crew. They're quiet, and they're thirsty. Keep your head cool. And you keep those water deeds tight. Don't leave them on the hook. I won't, Cade said. Good. Bram mounted his horse, his movements stiff. He looked toward the house, his voice softening slightly. That girl, she's got sand. Not many would have stood up to Pike like that. She's fine, Cade said, in a tone that closed the subject. Right, Bram tipped his hat. I'll file a report on Pike for intimidation. It'll keep him in town for a day or two, at least. He turned his horse and trotted away, a solitary, weary figure of order in a vast, lawless land. Cade stood alone in the yard, staring at the dust of the two departing riders. The silence that returned was heavier than before, filled with new threats. A sudden gust of wind, a precursor to the day's heat, swept across the yard. It rattled the tin roof of the barn. On a wooden peg near the barn door, an old, sun-bleached lariat had been hanging. The wind caught it, lifting it, making it dance for a moment. Then, the rope slipped free. It fell to the ground, landing in the pale dust in a loose, open coil. It looked exactly like a snare, like a hangman's noose waiting for a neck. Cade stared at it. Laura, watching from the window, stared at it. The target on Kestrel Ridge had just grown larger. The days that followed settled into a new, cautious rhythm, defined not by fear, but by function. The morning after Marshall Holloway's visit, Laura stepped out of the grain shed with a resolve that felt new and sharp. The air was still, the threat a palpable weight in the silence, but she would not be a refugee. She would not be a burden. She found Cade by the chicken coop, reinforcing a rusted latch with a piece of wire. His movements were economical, his focus absolute. Mr. Voss. He finished twisting the wire, his hands rough and sure, before acknowledging her. Ma'am. You said I could work if I chose, she said, her voice steadier than she felt. I'm choosing, I won't be the anchor that drags this ranch down. He finally looked up, his pale gray eyes assessing her. She was still in his oversized shirt, her feet and wrists bandaged, but she stood straight. The terror that had made her animalistic was gone, replaced by a brittle, human dignity. An anchor is a dead weight. Laura, work is motion. He gestured to the small, scattered flock of hens scratching in the dust. They need feed and water. The coop needs mucking. After that, the tack in the barn needs oil. It's sat too long, and dry leather cracks. He handed her a small feed bucket. It was not a kindness. It was an acceptance, a new contract, written in unspoken terms of mutual labor. The work was a balm. It was hard, and it hurt. Her hands, raw from the ropes, stung from the lye soap as she scrubbed the tack. Her feet throbbed, but every drop of sweat was a reclamation. Feeding the chickens, she felt the simple, honest pleasure of providing, cleaning the harnesses in the barn, surrounded by the rich scent of leather, hay, and horse. She felt a quiet purpose. This was real. Unlike Silas's gambling debts or Harlan's phantom claims, this was tangible. She was struggling with a stiff bridle, her fingers clumsy on the buckles. When Cade entered the barn, the sunlight silhouetting his frame, he didn't take the bridle from her. He picked up a length of spare rope from a peg. "You're fighting the leather," he said, his voice a low rumble. "You got to work with it, not against it. Same with this." He held the rope. "You'll need to know this knot." His calloused, scarred fingers moved with a surprising, fluid grace. This is a bowline. It makes a loop that won't slip, and it won't bind. No matter how much weight you put on it, you can tie a horse, secure a load, or pull a man from a flooded well. It's a knot that saves lives. Watch again. He looped the rope, the end moving like a snake. The rabbit comes out of the hole, goes around the tree, and back into the hole. He made her do it. Her fingers fumbled, her mind clouded by the memory of the ropes on her wrists. I'm not good with knots. You will be. His voice was patient, firm. Again. She tried, and it fell apart. Again. She did it. The loop held. She tugged on it, and it stayed fast. A small, hot spark of pride. A feeling she thought had been extinguished, lit in her chest. That night, they stood on the porch as the sky turned a deep, bruised violet. The silence stretched. "What do you hear?" he asked. "The windmill, crickets." "Listen past that." He nodded toward the dark, moving mass of his small herd, grazing by the low-running Silver Thread Creek. "Hear that? The low grunting, the sound of grass tearing, that's the sound of settled cattle. That's the sound of peace." He tilted his head. "If they go silent, all at once, that means a predator, a wolf, a mountain cat, or a man." His voice was flat, stating a fact. "And if you hear one high-pitched bawl, a calf separated from its mother, you ride, and you ride fast. You gotta learn to hear what's missing. Laura, that's how you survive out here. Not by listening to the noise, but by listening to the silence." The next day, the sun was a forge. The heat was a physical weight, suffocating, bleaching the very color from the landscape. By noon, the air shimmered, and the only sound was the incessant, dry rasp of cicadas. The windmill, their lifeline, was struggling. The water it pumped to the cattle trough near the corral had slowed to a trickle, and the trough itself, made of split logs, was leaking. A dark patch of mud was spreading and evaporating in the ruthless heat. Precious water was being lost. Cade was already there when Laura brought him a dipper of cool water from the shaded olla. He drained it in one long pull, the muscles in his throat working. He handed the dipper back, his brow furrowed in annoyance. The seams split, the woods warped. He was soaked in sweat, his blue cotton shirt dark and clinging to his back and chest. With a grunt of frustration, he grabbed the hem and pulled the wet shirt off over his head, tossing it onto a fence post. Laura had been about to offer help, but she froze. His back was to her as he bent to examine the trough. It was the back of a man built by relentless labor, the muscles of his shoulders and arms corded and tight. His skin tanned a deep bronze, but it was also a map of a different life. A long, puckered scar ran diagonally from his left shoulder blade down toward his right hip, the skin a silvery raised line against the tan. It was too straight, too clean, to be an accident with a plow. It was the mark of a cavalry saber. Another cluster of smaller, jagged scars mottled his side, near his ribs, as if an explosion had thrown shrapnel. These were not ranching wounds. This was the war. This was the why of his silence. The reason for the solitude he wore like a second skin. She felt a sudden, sharp jolt of understanding. This was the man Bram Holloway had known in the conflict. This was the man who had buried a wife and retreated into himself. She, who was running from the petty, brutal tyranny of two men, was standing in the presence of a man who had survived the vast, impersonal violence of a nation tearing itself apart. Cade, seemingly oblivious, or perhaps just indifferent, to her gaze, picked up his tools. He was focused on the problem: the wood, the leak, the wasted water. Laura felt like she was trespassing. She looked away, her face hot, staring at the shimmering heat rising from the barn roof, but the image of that scarred landscape was burned into her mind. Her curiosity was not idle. It was a profound, aching recognition of a pain far deeper than her own. The suffocating heat held for 2 more days, pressing down, making the air thick and yellow with dust. Then, on the 3rd afternoon, the world changed. The wind died, and the silence that fell was heavy, electric, and unnatural. To the west, the horizon turned a sickly, greenish-black. The air smelled of ozone. "Storm," Cade said, stepping onto the porch and tasting the air. "A dry one, all wind and lightning." He pointed to the large, rounded mound of cut hay near the barn. The ranch's lifeblood for the coming winter. It was covered by a massive canvas tarp, held down by ropes and heavy stones. "If that tarp gets loose, we lose the feed. Come on." They ran to the stack just as the first gust hit, a physical blow that stole their breath and threw dust in their eyes. The wind didn't rise. It attacked, howling like a living thing. The heavy canvas tarp, a foot thick with dust, began to buck and snap like the sail of a ship in a typhoon. "The grommets!" Cade yelled over the shriek of the wind. "We lose a corner. We lose it all. Hold the line." There was no time for lessons. There was no time for thought. They just worked. A corner tore free, the rope whipping wildly. Cade threw his entire weight onto the flapping canvas, wrestling it down. The rope Laura, the line. She scrambled, grabbing the frayed end. Dust filled the air, a choking brown cloud that reduced visibility to a few feet. A jagged fork of lightning split the sky directly overhead, followed an instant later by a crack of thunder so loud it vibrated in her bones. She didn't panic. She wrapped the rope around the anchoring post. Her hands, remembering their lesson, moved automatically. The rabbit comes out of the hole, around the tree, back into the hole. She pulled the bowline tight. It held. "Now," Cade shouted, and together they pulled the last main line taut, bracing their feet against the ground, their bodies straining as one against the gale. The tarp held. They staggered back to the porch, leaning against the rough-hewn wall of the house, breathing hard, their faces and hair caked in grit. They were both exhausted, but the hay was safe. Cade walked to the end of the porch and looked at the stack. He glanced at the knot she had tied. He didn't say "good job." He didn't say "thank you." He just nodded once, a sharp, clear acknowledgement of her competence. It felt more earned than any praise she had ever received. The next day, the world was washed clean, the air crisp. "You can't stay on this ranch if you can't ride," Cade stated. It was a fact, not a suggestion. I can ride," she said, her voice small. "Silas sold my mare, a long time ago." He led Lark out of the corral. She was a gentle-eyed buckskin, steady and calm. Lark won't spook unless you tell her to. He cupped his hands for her foot. Laura mounted, but as soon as she was in the saddle, her body went rigid. Her hands, gripping the leather reins, began to tremble violently. To be on a horse again, to be this high off the ground, brought back the tactile memory of her flight, the terror of being pursued. "She feels you," Cade said, his voice calm, holding the bridle. "You're telling her to be scared. Loosen your grip. Breathe." "I can't," she whispered, her eyes squeezed shut. "Yes, you can." His voice was not soft, but it was certain. "You stood up to Harlan Pike. You tied down a tarp in a full gale. This is just a horse, and she's on your side." He wasn't coddling her. He was reminding her of the strength she had already proven. Laura opened her eyes. She looked at his steady hand on the bridle, then at the mare's patient, waiting ear. She took a deep, shuddering breath and let it out, consciously uncurling her fingers from the reins. Lark, sensing the change, stopped sidestepping and blew out a soft, respectful snort. "There," Cade said, letting go of the bridle. "Now, just walk her, to the fence and back." She nudged the mare forward. Her hands were still shaking, but the fear was a dull echo. It was replaced by the steady, rhythmic motion of the horse, a feeling of control, of quiet power. She hadn't felt in what seemed like a lifetime. That evening, the routine was comfortable. They ate their dinner beans and smoked bacon in the growing dusk. The silence was no longer strained. It was shared. As she cleaned her plate, Laura found herself humming, a tiny, absent sound. It was an old tune, one her mother used to sing while rolling out pie crust. Shady Grove, she hummed it quietly. A ghost of a melody in the sparse, masculine room. She glanced at Cade, embarrassed, and stopped. Sorry, Cade was sitting very still, his mug halfway to his lips. He was a man who, she had learned, hated extra noise. He found no use for it. The wind, the cattle, the tools, those were sounds with purpose. Music was a frivolity he didn't indulge. But as the small, clear sound of her voice had filled the room, it hadn't felt like noise. It had felt, he realized, like the cracks in the walls were being filled. It was the first sound in this house in 5 years that wasn't connected to work, weather, or loss. "Don't stop," he said, his voice rough. The brief moment of softness passed. He set his mug down, the pragmatist returning. The quiet was a luxury, but the threat was real. "We need a plan," he said. Laura tensed. A plan. Pike, or the San Mesa riders, Bram's report won't keep them in town forever. If they ride in, and they ride in force, I can't be watching you and the yard at the same time. He stood and walked to the hearth, moving a worn bearskin rug. Underneath was a thick trapdoor with an iron ring. Root cellar. It's deep, it's solid, and the air pipe is hidden by the woodpile. He looked at her, his face serious. If you hear horses, and I'm not on that porch, you don't ask questions. You don't wait. You go there. You bolt it from the inside. You don't come out. Not for any reason. Not even if you hear fighting. You wait until I come and get you. That's the rule. It was a cold, hard dose of reality. Cade, I can't just hide like a child. Yes, you can, he said, his voice final. I handle the yard. You stay safe. We both have a job. That's the only way this works. The chill of the plan settled over them. They sat by the stove, the fire low. That song, Cade said, breaking the silence, his voice quieter now. Your mother's? Laura nodded, surprised he'd remembered. Yes, she was a kind woman, not built for this country. She smelled like cinnamon and apples. Her kitchen was always warm. Laura smiled, a tiny, sad expression. I remember the sound of her flour sifter. A little whisk, whisk, whisk. She looked at her own calloused, dirty hands. It feels like another life, a different person. Cade stared into the fire's dying embers. My wife, Amelia. She hated the wind here, said it scoured everything clean, even memory. He poked the fire, a log collapsing in a shower of sparks. I'm not like your mother's kitchen, he said, the admission costing him. I'm not built for comfort. I tolerate solitude better than I tolerate crowds. After the war, silence just seemed to fit better. It's easier. Easier, Laura whispered, looking at his profile in the firelight. But it's still lonely. He met her gaze. He didn't deny it. It was, yes. That night, Laura went to the grain shed. She slid the heavy bar into place, but it no longer felt like a defense against the world. It felt like a simple lock on her own door. In the main house, Cade lay on his cot. The windmill turned, its creak, creak, creak a steady, metallic lullaby. The cattle were quiet, settled. For the first time since she had fled Silas Kern's house, Laura fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. She felt impossibly safe. She did not see Cade rise from his cot 3 hours later, in the dead of night. He didn't light a lamp. He moved to the chair by the front window, the one that faced the main trail. He didn't hold a rifle. His sidearm was enough. He just sat, and he watched. He watched the moon trail its silver path across the yard. He watched the shadows of the mesas shorten and then lengthen again toward the west. And he kept watch until the first pale gray light of dawn touched the horizon, a silent guardian for the woman sleeping in his barn. In the hard, dry-packed soil of Kestrel Ridge, a place that had only known survival, something new had been planted. It was a fragile thing, this trust, but in the shelter of shared work and quiet nights, it was beginning to take root. The ranch was an island, a self-contained world of work and quiet understanding. But islands cannot sustain themselves forever. The flour sack was nearly empty, and the nails Cade needed to repair the corral fence were gone. Juniper Flats was a necessity. It was also a crucible. Laura knew this. The thought of returning to the town that had been her cage sent a tremor of the old fear through her. But the woman who had collapsed at Kestrel Ridge's fence line was not the same woman who now stood in the morning light. She had spent 2 days with a needle and thread, painstakingly altering one of Cade's spare work shirts. She took in the seams, shortened the sleeves, her small, neat stitches a quiet declaration of permanence. It was still his shirt, but it was now her fit. "You don't have to come," Cade said, watching her from the doorway. He was saddling his big roan gelding. The sounds of his work, the creak of leather, the jingle of the bit, a familiar morning song. "They need to see I'm not a prisoner," Laura replied, her voice firm. She pulled on the wide-brimmed hat he'd given her, its shadow a welcome shield. "And I need to see it, too." He considered her for a moment, then gave a single, sharp nod. The matter was settled. The ride into town was tense. The silence between them was not the comfortable quiet of the ranch. It was the watchful silence of 2 soldiers entering enemy territory. Laura sat astride Lark, her back straight, her hands light on the reins. She was a different person in the saddle, no longer trembling, but alert, her gaze scanning the horizon as Cade had taught her. Juniper Flats appeared as a smudge of brown and gray against the endless pale blue sky. As they drew closer, the smudge resolved into a single, dusty main street, flanked by a dozen sun-bleached wooden buildings. It was a place of stark contrasts, the deep, cool shade of the covered boardwalks and the blinding glare of the street, the boisterous, false cheer spilling from the saloon, and the tight-lipped judgment of the churchgoers. As they dismounted and tied their horses to the hitching rail in front of the General Mercantile, the town seemed to hold its breath. A curtain twitched in a window. A man whittling on a bench suddenly became very interested in the grain of his wood. Every eye was on them. Laura could feel the weight of their stares. A physical pressure. She pulled the brim of her hat lower. Cade acted as if he felt nothing. He moved with a deliberate, unhurried pace, his presence a challenge to the whispers. Inside the Mercantile, the air was thick with the smells of coffee beans, cured tobacco, and bolts of calico. Deacon Tolliver was at the counter, a portly man whose piety was as starched and stiff as his white collar. His eyes, small and dark, landed on Laura and narrowed with sanctimonious disapproval. "Voss," Tolliver said, his voice oozing a condescending concern, "a man of your solitary nature, taking in strays, the good book preaches charity. Of course, but one must be mindful of appearances, of a woman's virtue." The word hung in the air, a greasy stain. Laura flinched, the color draining from her face. Cade didn't raise his voice. He didn't square his shoulders. He didn't even look angry. He simply turned his head and met the deacon's gaze. Cade's pale gray eyes were flat, empty of emotion, and utterly immovable. It was a look that said, without a single word, "You are a small, insignificant thing, and I am done with you." It was a look that had been perfected on battlefields, and it was devastatingly effective. Deacon Tolliver's face flushed. He stammered, cleared his throat, and suddenly found a pressing need to examine a barrel of pickles. The moment was over. Cade had drawn a line, and the deacon had scurried back behind it. Across the street, the bat-wing doors of the Copper Lily Saloon swung open, letting out a blast of noise and the smell of stale beer. A woman stood in the doorway, wiping her hands on a linen apron. This was Mabel Crow. She was a woman in her 40s, with knowing eyes and a face that had seen every kind of trouble Juniper Flats could offer. Her gaze swept over the scene, the flustered deacon, Cade's rigid back, and Laura's pale face. She took in Laura's bandaged wrists, visible for a moment as she adjusted her hat. She saw the altered shirt, the way the woman stood close to Cade without touching him. Mabel Crow didn't just see gossip. She saw a story, And she was a woman who knew how to read the fine print. Her expression held no judgment, only a sharp, assessing curiosity. While Cade dealt with their supplies, he gave Laura a coin. "Go see the doc," he said, his voice low. "End of the street. Ada Merriweather. Tell her I said to give you a salve for those rope burns, the good kind." Laura found the small, neat office with a painted sign A. Merriweather. Inside, the air was cool and smelled of carbolic soap and dried herbs. Dr. Ada was a woman near 30, with intelligent, direct eyes and a calm, professional manner that was a world away from the town's prying stares. "Mr. Voss sent you," Ada said, not as a question. She motioned for Laura to sit. "Let me see your wrists." Laura unwrapped the crude bandages. Ada examined the raw, chafed skin. Her touch gentle but firm. This wasn't an accident with a hay rope. "No, ma'am," Laura whispered. "I heard Harlan Pike was making a fool of himself," Ada said, her voice neutral as she opened a jar of a thick, pungent yellow ointment, "and that Silas Kern has been crying into his whiskey about being robbed." She began to apply the salve. It was cool and immediately soothing. "Silas isn't just crying, he's plotting." Laura looked up, startled. "News travels in a small town," Ada said, her focus on her work. "The word is, Silas is no longer Pike's problem. He sold the debt, all of it, to the Sand Mesa riders. They don't care about you, girl. They care about what Silas told them he has a claim on. Cade's water." The threat that had been a shadow on the horizon was now a named, specific danger. Ada finished wrapping Laura's wrists with clean, white linen bandages. "Legally," she said, her voice dropping, "Pike has no claim on you. An agreement made with a third party to settle a debt is not a marriage contract. It's indenturement at best, and that's illegal in this territory. You are a free woman, but the law is only as strong as the man who enforces it." She pressed the small jar of salve into Laura's hand. "You tell Cade to be careful. The San Mesa crew won't knock on his door with a court order." As Laura stepped back onto the boardwalk, her head spinning, she saw a small crowd gathered in front of the marshal's office. Bram Holloway was there, a hammer in his hand, tacking a piece of paper to the public notice board. His voice boomed across the street. "Let it be known, as of today, by territorial decree, any attempt to force an individual into a marriage contract through coercion, threat, or settlement of debt will be met with immediate arrest and a mandatory jail sentence. This is the law." A murmur went through the crowd. Some men nodded in grim approval. Others, friends of Pike and Silas, scowled and turned away. The town was drawing a line, just as Cade had. You were on one side, or you were on the other. Laura watched, the jar of salve cool in her hand. For the first time, she pictured a future. She imagined riding into this town not as a fugitive, but as Laura Benton of Kestrel Ridge, a woman who worked, who rode her own horse, who was no one's property. The thought was so powerful, so intoxicating, it made her dizzy. In that moment, the last of the guests fell away. She wanted to stay. She wanted to fight for that piece of land, for that quiet man, for that future. Cade met her by the horses, the supplies packed in his saddlebags. He looked at the professionally wrapped bandages on her wrists, and then at her face. He saw the new resolve in her eyes. He didn't comment on it. Instead, his gaze fell to her feet, still clad in the tattered, ruined shoes she'd been wearing. He turned without a word and walked to a stall in front of the blacksmith's, where a cobbler had laid out a small selection of used and repaired boots. He picked up a pair. They were sturdy, plain, and made of thick, oiled leather. They were not pretty. They were made to last. He turned them over, examining the soles, the stitching. He held them up, his eyes narrowing as he judged the size. He paid the cobbler a few coins, then walked back to Laura and held them out. "Try these," he said. Laura was speechless. It was such a practical, unromantic gesture. And yet, it was the most profound gift she had ever received. A man had never bought her anything that wasn't meant to be a decoration, a chain, or a cage. This was a foundation. She sat on the edge of the boardwalk and pulled them on. They were snug. The thick leather a solid, protective embrace around her damaged feet. They fit? They fit perfectly. She stood up, flexing her ankles. For the first time, she felt truly grounded, connected to the earth. She looked up at Cade, and a smile, a real, unbidden, brilliant smile lit up her face. It was like the sun breaking through a week of storm clouds. Cade was startled by it. He looked away, a faint flush rising on his weathered neck, and busied himself with checking the horse's cinches. The ride home began in that warm, quiet glow, but as they left the last buildings of Juniper Flats behind, Cade's posture changed. He became more alert, his gaze sweeping the low hills and rocky outcrops that lined the trail. "We've got company," he said, his voice a low murmur. Laura's heart jumped. She looked back. Far behind them, a single rider was keeping pace, a small cloud of dust trailing him. He made no move to catch up, but he didn't fall behind, either. "Sand Mesa," she whispered. "Could be, or just one of Pike's drunk friends with a long memory." Cade's face was grim. "Either way, I don't like being followed home." He didn't spur his horse. He kept his pace steady, lulling the rider into a sense of security. But as they approached a fork in the trail, Cade made his decision. Instead of taking the main path, he veered sharply right, onto a narrow, barely there track that led into a maze of dry washes and dense, thorny scrub known as Sagebrush Hollow. "Stay close," he ordered. The path was treacherous. Sharp rocks littered the ground, and thorny branches clawed at their legs. Cade navigated the twisting, turning landscape with an instinct born of years. He led them down into a dry arroyo, the high walls hiding them from view, then up a steep bank that offered a brief vantage point. They stopped. Below, on the main trail, their pursuer pulled up, confused. He scanned the empty landscape, then, after a moment of hesitation, continued on the main path, convinced he had imagined them. Cade waited until the rider was gone. He didn't relax. He just turned his horse and continued on, taking the long, hard way back to Kestrel Ridge. They arrived as the sun was setting, painting the sky in fiery streaks of orange and red. The long shadows of the mesas stretched across the valley like dark, grasping fingers. They had gone to town for flour and nails. They had come back with allies, declared enemies, and a new, unspoken partnership forged in the face of public scrutiny. Laura slid from Lark's back, her feet solid on the ground in her new boots. She looked at the small, defiant ranch house, at Cade's quiet, formidable silhouette against the bloody sky. This wasn't just a place to hide anymore. It was a place to defend. And as the last of the light died, a cold, hard resolve settled over Kestrel Ridge. If the shadows were coming for them, they would not be found cowering. They would be found waiting, and they would be ready. The deep, impenetrable dark of a moonless night pressed down on Kestrel Ridge. It was a silence so profound, it was almost a sound in itself, broken only by the too familiar, comforting rhythms of the ranch, the distant, soft grunt of settled cattle, and the high, metallic creak of the windmill's sucker rod, pulling life-giving water from the earth. Inside the main house, Cade Voss slept the light, watchful sleep of a soldier. He was a man tuned to the frequencies of his land. In the grain shed, Laura slept in her new boots, a habit she'd adopted, a symbol that she was ready to move, to act, not just to hide. Then, the rhythm broke. The creak of the windmill stopped. It was replaced by a short, sharp, metallic shriek, the sound of a tension cable snapping. Then, a low, grating groan as the shaft was tampered with. Cade was on his feet before his eyes were fully open. His hand found the cold steel of his sidearm on the crate beside his cot. He didn't light a lamp. He moved to the window, a shadow against the dark. They were violating the heart of the ranch, not the house, not the barn, the water. It was the San Mesa riders, It was Silas's revenge. He heard a low, threatening growl from the porch. Rook, his wiry-haired ranch dog, was on his feet, hackles raised, staring at the base of the windmill tower. Cade eased the cabin door open. The hinges, well-oiled, making no sound. He saw them too, maybe 3 men, working with files and a heavy pry bar at the windmill's gearbox. In the grain shed, Laura had bolted upright. The absence of the windmill's song was what woke her. It was the missing sound Cade had warned her about. Her heart hammered against her ribs. A wild, trapped bird. She heard the low growl of the dog, then a man's curse, low and vicious. They were here. The rule was to go to the root cellar, to hide. A sudden sharp crash of metal on metal echoed from the yard. They were breaking the pump. Laura looked at the heavy bar on her door. Hiding was the old Laura. Hiding was what had almost gotten her destroyed. She grabbed the brass handbell from the crate. Cade moved from the porch shadow, a swift, dark shape. "Get away from it," he commanded, his voice a low, lethal crack in the night. The men spun, surprised. They hadn't expected him to be so fast, so quiet. One of them, a bulky silhouette, raised the pry bar. "It's just one man." Cade didn't wait. He moved in, not with his gun, but with his body. He was a veteran of close-quarters combat. He drove his shoulder into the first man's gut, a hard, debilitating blow that sent the man crumpling with a sharp woof of expelled air. The second man, smaller, pulled a knife and lunged. At that exact second, a sound ripped through the night, frantic, high-pitched, and shockingly loud, the violent, continuous ringing of the alarm bell. Clang, clang, clang. Clang. It was Laura, standing in the doorway of the grain shed, ringing the bell with all her strength, an auditory beacon of pure, defiant alarm. Rook, the dog, took the bell as his signal, exploding from the porch in a fury of barks and snapping teeth, charging the second man. The man shrieked, kicking at the dog. The distraction was all Cade needed. He brought the barrel of his pistol down hard on the man's extended wrist, and a sharp crack echoed in the yard as the knife clattered to the dirt. The man howled in pain. The first man, the one Cade had hit, was scrambling to his feet, pulling his own sidearm. "Cade!" Laura screamed. The man raised his pistol, not at Cade, but at the source of the noise at her. Cade lunged, tackling the man around the knees. They went down in a cloud of dust and curses, a tangle of limbs. Laura heard the dull, solid thud of a fist connecting with a jaw, and the man went limp. The second man, clutching his broken wrist, saw his partner unconscious. He looked at Cade, who was rising from the ground, a formidable shadow. He looked at the dog, who was circling and growling, and he looked at Laura, still standing in the doorway, the bell in one hand, her face pale but set. This wasn't the easy job they'd been promised. The man turned and fled, crashing through the greasewood, disappearing into the absolute dark. The silence that rushed back in was deafening, broken only by the pained groans of the unconscious man and Laura's ragged, gasping breaths. "Laura the lariat! By the barn door!" Cade's voice was sharp, all command. She didn't question, she ran, grabbed the thick coil of rope from the peg, and ran back. Cade was hauling the intruder, a burly, bearded man, onto the porch, his hands behind his back. "Tie his hands, now." Laura's fingers were numb, shaking violently with the adrenaline. She dropped the rope. I can't." "Yes, you can." Cade's voice was like stone. "The knot, the one I taught you. Do it." She picked up the rope. Her mind was blank with panic. The rabbit, the hole, the tree. She forced her clumsy, trembling fingers to move. She looped the rope around the man's thick wrists. The rabbit comes out of the hole, around the tree, back into the hole. She pulled the knot tight. It wasn't pretty. It wasn't the clean loop of a practiced rancher, But it was a bowline, and it would not slip. Her skill, learned for work, had just become her weapon. The captured man spat a curse at her. "You're dead, both of you, when Harlan gets here. He'll—" Cade put a boot on the man's back, silencing him. He looked out into the darkness where the other man had fled. The immediate danger was over. The future was now infinitely more complicated. He turned to Laura. She was still standing where she had tied the knot, the empty rope end in her hand, staring at the bound man. "Laura." She didn't respond. "Laura, in the shed." She looked at him, her eyes wide and dark, uncomprehending. She was in shock. He took her arm gently, his touch a stark contrast to the violence of the last few minutes, and guided her back into the grain storehouse. He lit the lantern, and the small space was flooded with warm, dancing light. The moment the light hit her face, the facade of strength shattered. A violent tremor took hold of her. It started in her hands and spread to her entire body. A debilitating, bone-rattling shake. It was the adrenaline crash, the body's payment for the terror it had just endured. She slid down the rough wooden wall, her new boots scraping the floor, and buried her face in her hands, her shoulders heaving. Cade watched her for a moment, his face hard to read in the shifting light. He turned, grabbed the heavy wool blanket from her cot, and draped it around her shaking shoulders. He didn't pat her. He didn't soothe. He just gave her the warmth. He was about to turn, to go deal with the prisoner, when the lantern light caught a dark, wet streak on her temple, disappearing into her hairline. "You're bleeding," his voice was low. She looked up, confused, and touched her head. Her fingers came away bloody. She must have struck her head on the doorframe in her frantic dash to ring the bell. It's nothing," she stammered, the shaking making her teeth chatter. "Stay still." He took the clean cloth he kept for his gear, dipped it in the small water bucket by the door, and knelt in front of her. The shed was tiny, and the space between them was suddenly charged, intimate, and stripped of all pretense. The night's violence had burned away the polite distances they had kept. He was all quiet focus. His rough, calloused thumb tipped her chin up to the light. His other hand, holding the damp cloth, was incredibly gentle as he dabbed at the small, shallow cut. He smelled of dust, sweat, and the cold night air. Laura's shaking began to subside, replaced by a different kind of tremor. She was acutely aware of his closeness. This man of silence, this man of scars and solitude, had just fought for her. He had trusted her to act. Her gaze was fixed on his face, on the concentration in his pale eyes. As he worked, his shirt, torn at the shoulder during the struggle, gaped open. The lantern light fell directly on the silvery, puckered line of the old saber scar, the one she had seen at the water trough. Her body moved before her mind did. Her hand, still trembling, lifted from her lap. She didn't ask. She didn't hesitate. She laid her fingers directly on the scar, her touch so light it was barely a whisper. Cade went absolutely still. His hand froze, the cloth poised an inch from her forehead. He didn't breathe. It was a touch that breached 5 years of defenses. "Why?" Laura's voice was a ragged whisper, barely audible over the pounding of her own heart. The question was not about the fight. It was about everything. "Why are you like this? Cade, why are you so alone?" His eyes, which had been focused on her wound, lifted to meet hers. She was too close. She was seeing too much. He could feel the warmth of her fingers through the thin cotton of his shirt, a brand on his old wound. He should have pulled away. He should have stood up, made a gruff comment, and left. That was the man he had been. But she had rung the bell. She hadn't hidden. She had tied the knot. He let out a long, slow breath and set the cloth down. He didn't move away, but his gaze dropped to the floor. "I wasn't always," he said, his voice rougher than usual. "Before the war, I had someone." He swallowed, the words tasting like rust. "Amelia, my fiancée." He stopped, the silence stretching. heavy with the things he had never said. "I went to fight," he continued, his voice flat, reporting a fact. "I was gone 3 years. I wrote, she wrote, then her letters stopped. I told myself it was the mail lines, the army's moving." He paused. "I came home. I was too late. It wasn't a bullet. It was the fever, the chaos that follows the lines. She'd been gone 6 months when I got back." He lifted his head, and his eyes were hollow, looking at a ghost Laura couldn't see. "After that, after you see what people are, what they'll do, hope feels like a lie, a trap. So I came out here, this land. It's hard, but it's honest. It doesn't promise you anything it can't deliver." "Silence," he said. "Silence is safe. It can't be taken from you." Laura listened, her heart aching. He wasn't a man who hated the world. He was a man in mourning, a man who had built a fortress of solitude to protect the broken thing inside him. She looked at him, at this powerful, capable, and profoundly lonely man. He had just given her his truth, his armor, and she knew, with a sudden, sharp clarity, that it wasn't the whole truth, it was the excuse. Her hand was still on his shoulder. She leaned in, her voice dropping to an intense, challenging whisper. "Show me why you're alone." Cade's head snapped up, his eyes, pale and sharp, locked with hers. He was completely, visibly stunned. He had expected her to recoil, to offer pity, to do anything but demand more. What he breathed. "You're not alone because of a ghost. Cade," her voice was shaking, but not with fear, it was with conviction. "You're alone because you choose it. You've shown me your ranch. You've shown me your strength. You've shown me your past." Her eyes held his, unwavering. "Now show me the real reason. Show me why you're alone." It was a challenge. It was an invitation. It was a declaration that she was not afraid of him, or his past, or the scars he used to keep the world at bay. For the first time since she had met him, Cade Voss looked truly, utterly unguarded. He searched her face, looking for the trick, for the trap. He found only her, earnest and demanding and illuminated in the lantern light. He let out a breath that seemed to tear from his lungs, a sound like dry sand pouring from a bag. It was the sigh of a man who had been holding his breath for 5 years. "Because," he whispered, his voice cracking, the confession was ripped from him. "Because this," he gestured to the scar, to his torn shirt, to the dark shed. "This is the cost, and no one's ever wanted to stay. Laura, not after they saw it all, not after they knew." They stared at each other. It was not a man looking at a woman he had rescued. It was not a woman looking at her protector. It was a recognition, soul to soul, in the dark, with the adrenaline of a shared battle pounding in their blood. He had seen her raw terror and her defiant courage. She had seen his hidden wounds and his profound loneliness. The moment was too charged, too heavy to hold. The air was vibrating. Cade was the one who broke. He was a man flayed open, and his instincts screamed for cover. He stood up abruptly, putting distance between them. The movement was jerky, awkward, unlike his usual fluid grace. I have to secure the prisoner," he said, his voice rough, formal. "And check the windmill. See what's left." He turned and strode out of the shed, leaving her in the warm, flickering light, the heavy blanket pooled at her feet. Laura watched him go. Her hand, which had touched his scar, now tingling, alive with a warmth that had nothing to do with the night's violence. She was still trembling, but it wasn't the crash of adrenaline, it was the start of an earthquake. The dawn that broke over Kestrel Ridge was cold and sharp. The air was thin, stripped of its usual warmth, as if the violence of the night had scoured it clean. Cade had returned from town just before sunrise, a grim, solitary rider. He had delivered the bound man, whose name was Jeb, to Marshal Holloway, along with a terse, factual account of the night's events. Now, he stood by the crippled windmill, a wrench in his hand, staring at the damage. The tension cable was snapped, and the gearbox was a mess of bent metal and scored iron. The heart of the ranch was broken. Laura brought him coffee. She didn't speak, just set the steaming mug on a flat rock beside him. The raw, intimate confession in the grain shed hung in the air between them, a fragile, vibrating thing. They were no longer just a rancher and a refugee. They were two people who had seen the deepest wounds in each other. It was a terrifying and exhilarating new landscape, and neither of them knew how to navigate it. Work was the only map they had. "They didn't come for me," Laura said, her voice quiet but clear. She looked at the damaged pump. "And they didn't come for the house. They came for the water, to break it, to make this land worthless." Cade grunted, his attention fixed on a sheared bolt. "It's the only play Silas has." "Then it's the one we have to beat," she said, a new authority in her tone. "A deed is just a piece of paper," Bram said, "but what if it isn't? What if we make it real? What if we refile the claim? Not with the old boundary stones that Silas can claim are in the wrong place, but with new markers, stakes driven deep. We can draw a new map, an updated one, and have Bram witness it. We make your claim not just a historical fact, but a current event." Cade stopped his probing of the gearbox. He turned and looked at her, truly looked at her. Her face was pale in the morning light, her hair still messy, but her eyes were clear and fiercely intelligent. She wasn't just offering help. She was offering a strategy. She had taken the chaos of the attack and forged it into a plan. He was silent for a long moment. "That's a good thought," he admitted, the praise sounding foreign on his tongue. "It's more than a thought," she pressed. "It's work. It's something we can do." That afternoon, the sparse main room of the ranch house was transformed into a war room. Cade unrolled the original deed on the scrubbed clean table. It was a yellowed, brittle document. The ink faded, the lines of the survey map drawn in a careful, spidery hand. For Cade, this paper was a sacred text, the foundation of his solitary world. Handing it to her felt like handing over his own heart for inspection. Laura was reverent. She handled the document with a surgeon's care. Using a fresh piece of paper and a nub of charcoal, she began to meticulously copy the boundaries. Her hand was steady, her lines precise. While she drew, she spoke, her voice low and focused. "We'll need a dozen new posts. Cedar, if you have it, it won't rot. We'll need a mallet, a plumb line to keep them true, and red paint, something bright, that the sun can't bleach away in a year." She was making a list, her mind already on the physical task, turning her abstract plan into a concrete list of materials. Cade watched her, a strange feeling stirring in his chest. He had run this ranch alone for 5 years. He had made every decision, solved every problem in silence. Now, this woman, who had arrived with nothing but terror and her own 2 feet, was methodically, logically, helping him save it. "While you're at the deed," he said, his voice rough, "we need signals." He led her to the porch. "This place is too open. I can't always see you, and you can't always see me. From now on, listen for the railing." He rapped his knuckles sharply on the thick wooden beam. "Knock, knock, knock. 3 times. That means danger is close, not on the horizon, but in the yard. You don't ask, you don't look, you go to the cellar. Understood." She nodded, her eyes wide. He knocked again, twice this time. "Knock, knock, 2 times, all clear, or I'm coming in. Either way, it's safe." They practiced it, the simple code becoming their own secret language, a rhythm of security laid over the land's silence. The next day brought a new development. A young boy from a neighboring homestead rode up, delivering a basket of eggs. A neighborly gesture, tucked inside one of the eggshells, which was carefully cracked and emptied, was a tightly rolled scrap of paper. It was from Mabel Crow. The note was short, the handwriting a swift, sharp scrawl. "Silas is buying whiskey for every man with a pen. He's collecting signatures for a petition to the county judge, claiming your water rights are fraudulent. He's paying 2 bits a name. Watch your back." He's trying to create a paper trail, Cade said, his voice grim, crumpling the note in his fist. To make his lie look like a town consensus. Then we need our own paper, Laura said, her jaw set. She rode into town alone. It was a deliberate act of defiance. She would not be scared away. She went first to Dr. Ada Merriweather's office. Ada listened to the story of the night attack, her face calm but her eyes sharp. She examined the small cut on Laura's temple and the new bruises on her arms from the struggle. "I'll write an official medical report," Ada said, already pulling out a fresh sheet of paper and her good ink pen. "I'll document your initial injuries, the rope burns, the lacerations on your feet, and I'll document these new wounds, sustained while defending Mr. Voss's property from an intruder." She looked up, her gaze direct. "The report will formally state that your injuries are inconsistent with a consensual marital arrangement and consistent with flight from a violent captor. It will give Marshal Holloway legal ammunition." Laura left Ada's office with the sealed document, a powerful piece of her own truth, weaponized by the law. When she returned to the ranch, she found Cade waiting for her by the corral. He had a rifle propped against the fence. It was an old Spencer, heavy and solid. "You need to know how to use this," he said. "I've never fired a gun," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I'm not teaching you to kill," he said, his voice firm. "I'm teaching you to make noise." He held up a cartridge. It had a paper wad where the lead bullet should have been. "A blank, all powder and noise. It won't hit anything, but it sounds like the wrath of God." He made her hold the rifle. It was heavier than she imagined. The wood stock smooth and cool, the steel barrel smelling of oil. "It's a tool, Laura, nothing more." He showed her how to load it, how to sight it, how to brace the stock against her shoulder so the kick wouldn't break her collarbone. "Aim high," he said, standing behind her, his voice a low rumble near her ear. "Just point it at the sky. Squeeze the trigger. Don't jerk it." She flinched as she pulled the trigger. The explosion was deafening. A massive boom that echoed off the mesas. The rifle kicked back hard, a solid punch to her shoulder. The smell of gunpowder was sharp, acrid. "Again," he said. She did it again, and again, until the flinch was gone, until the weight of the rifle felt familiar, until the noise was something she commanded, not something that scared her. The next morning, Laura was up before dawn. She mixed cornmeal and water, her hands moving with a purpose that felt new. She baked a pan of cornbread, the simple, honest smell filling the small cabin. She packed the warm bread in a clean cloth. She took her newly drawn map, the list of materials, and Ada's sealed medical report. She saddled Lark herself, her hands sure on the buckles, the bowline on the hitching post a perfect, clean knot. When Cade came out of the cabin, she was already mounted, a slim, determined figure in the pale morning light. "I'm going to see the marshal," she announced. "Silas is building an army of lies. We're going to build an arsenal of facts." Cade looked at her, at the package of warm bread, at the papers tucked in her saddlebag, at the resolute set of her jaw. She was no longer asking for permission. She was a partner. All he said was, "Ride careful." That night, after she returned with Bram's signed affidavit witnessing the new map, they went to work. The moon was a thin, silver sliver, providing just enough light to see by. They had to repair the windmill. The work was heavy, greasy, and frustrating. They had to hoist the bent gearbox down, using a system of ropes and pulleys. Cade was the strength, his muscles straining as he held the weight. Laura was the second pair of hands, the clear head, guiding the ropes, keeping the tension even. They worked in a shared, rhythmic silence, a silent waltz of labor, the grunt of Cade's effort as he took the strain, the scrape of metal as Laura worked a new bolt into place, the shared, sharp intake of breath as a heavy piece threatened to slip. Sweat slicked their skin, cooling in the night breeze. Grease stained their hands and faces. "2 more turns," Cade grunted from beneath the gearbox, his voice tight with effort. "Count them out for me." Laura said, her voice clear in the darkness as she pulled the rope taut. She watched his muscles bunch, the play of shadows on his back. 2. Cade let the weight settle, then slowly straightened up, wiping a greasy hand across his forehead. He was looking at her, and in the faint moonlight, she saw it, a small, almost imperceptible upturn at the corner of his mouth. He was smiling. It wasn't a grin. It was a quiet, private expression of something that looked like peace. The sound of her voice, counting for him, working with him, had breached a wall that 5 years of solitude had built. Later, as they were tensioning the new cable, she was on the platform. He was on the ground. She had to lean out, her position precarious, to secure a nut. She felt her foot slip on a patch of grease. She gasped, her balance gone. Before she could fall, a hand shot out and clamped around her ankle, steadying her. It was Cade. His grip was like iron, sure and absolute. He didn't say anything. He just held her, a silent, solid anchor, until she had her footing again. She looked down at him. His hand was still on her ankle, his calloused, rough fingers a circle of warmth and strength. He was always there. He had taught her to ride, to shoot, to tie a knot, but he had always let her hold the reins. The rifle, the rope, he always let her take the lead. His strength a half step behind her, a safety net she hadn't even realized she was relying on. His hand, she realized, was rough from labor, but gentle in its purpose. He let go, and she finished her work. The windmill was whole again. They stood on the porch, exhausted, dirty, and victorious. Cade pulled the handle, and the sucker rod engaged. The familiar, rhythmic creak, creak, creak returned. A steady heartbeat restored to the ranch. It was the sound of survival. It was the sound of their partnership. The sky had been a searing, cloudless blue for a week, a relentless weight pressing down on Kestrel Ridge. Then, one afternoon, the pressure broke. The air went unnaturally still. The cicadas fell silent, and a strange, yellow-green light bled into the atmosphere, making the familiar landscape look alien and menacing. To the west, the horizon was no longer a clean line. It was a roiling, boiling wall of brown, a solid entity that was consuming the sky. Cade stepped out onto the porch, his face grim. He didn't need to taste the air. He could feel it, a static charge on his skin. "Dust storm," he said, his voice a low rumble. "A bad one, and it's bringing rain with it." Laura was already moving. The frantic rush to secure the haymow had been a lesson learned. This was different. It wasn't a surprise attack. It was a siege they could see coming. There was no panic, only a grim, focused efficiency. They moved as a team, a silent dance of shared purpose. Laura ran to the chicken coop, herding the confused hens inside and barring the small door. Cade wrestled the heavy wooden shutters over the cabin's windows, the thick planks groaning as he dropped the iron bars into place, plunging the interior into a premature twilight. The first gust of wind hit them like a physical blow, a great, invisible hand shoving them, stealing the air from their lungs. It was hot, and carried the dry, gritty taste of the deep desert. The world dissolved into a maelstrom of swirling, stinging sand. The sun vanished. Noon became midnight. "The barn doors!" Cade yelled over the rising howl of the wind. "They can't catch the wind." They fought their way across the yard, leaning into the gale, their hats ripped from their heads. The wind shrieked, a sound that wasn't just air moving, but the rage of the land itself. It sounded like a pack of starving wolves, circling, hunting. They reached the massive, sliding barn doors together. It took both their bodies, straining as one, to force the heavy doors shut against the immense pressure of the wind. As Cade dropped the thick wooden crossbar into its iron brackets, the world outside disappeared completely. They were sealed in, the only sounds the thunderous roar of the wind and the percussive ping-ping-ping of sand and small pebbles striking the wooden walls. And then came the rain. It didn't start as a drizzle. It came as a sudden, violent deluge, as if the sky had ripped open. The sound changed from a dry roar to a wet, furious drumming. They could hear it hammering the tin roof of the barn, a deafening, relentless assault. "The porch," Cade said, his voice barely audible. "We waited out there." They made their way back to the house, heads down, shoulders hunched against the onslaught. The porch, with its deep overhang, was a small haven of relative quiet. The rain fell in solid, silvery sheets just feet from where they stood, turning the dusty yard into a churning sea of mud. They were both soaked, their clothes plastered to their skin. Sand, now transformed into a gritty paste, covered their faces, their hair, their hands. Cade ran a hand over his face, wiping away a film of mud. His shirt was heavy, dripping, and caked with the stuff. With a grunt of weary disgust, he did what any man would do in his own home. He grabbed the wet hem of his shirt and pulled it off over his head, tossing the sodden garment onto the railing to be beaten clean by the rain. He stood with his back to her, wringing out his hair, oblivious. The dim, storm-lit air was cool, and goosebumps rose on his skin. He was just a man getting out of a wet shirt. But for Laura, the act was a revelation. In the faint, gray light, his back was a landscape. The deep bronze of his skin, the powerful play of muscles as he moved, and the scars, the long, silvery slash of the saber wound and the jagged cluster of shrapnel marks were no longer just evidence of a past trauma. They were part of him, as integral as the color of his eyes or the low rumble of his voice. They were the map of the man who had chosen solitude, the physical text of his pain. The sight unlocked a wave of profound, aching tenderness in her. This wasn't pity. Pity was for the weak. This was empathy, a deep, silent understanding of the price he had paid. She turned and went into the darkened cabin, her eyes adjusting to the gloom. She found a clean, dry towel in the chest where he kept his linens. When she returned to the porch, he was still standing there, staring out at the storm, a solitary, formidable figure. She held the towel out to him. He turned, surprised, as if he had forgotten she was there. He took it, his rough fingers brushing hers. The brief contact sent a small, electric jolt through her. As he began to dry his hair and shoulders, she didn't retreat. She stood her ground. Her fingers, acting on an impulse she didn't try to suppress, lifted. She reached out and laid her fingertips, ever so lightly, directly on the raised, smooth line of the saber scar on his shoulder. He froze. Every muscle in his back and shoulders went rigid. He stopped breathing. It was a touch of impossible gentleness against a wound of absolute violence. It was an acknowledgement, an acceptance, a question asked without words. "You are alone," she said, her voice a soft murmur that was nearly lost in the drumming of the rain. "Because you think you are a burden." The truth of it, spoken so simply, seemed to shatter the stillness in him. A long, shuddering breath escaped his lips. He didn't turn around. "And I," she continued, her own voice trembling slightly as she confessed her own truth, "am afraid of being owned again." There it was. The two fears that had defined their separate solitudes, laid bare between them in the heart of the storm. His fear of being too broken to be loved, and her fear of being too whole to be free. Cade finally turned, the towel clutched in his hand. He was close, so close she could feel the heat radiating from his skin. His pale gray eyes, usually so guarded, were wide, raw, and full of a storm that matched the one outside. He looked at her hand, still resting on his shoulder, then met her gaze. His voice was a hoarse whisper. "Laura." He said her name as if it were a prayer and a warning. "We only move forward when we both want to." He took a breath, his gaze unwavering, his promise absolute. "Only when it's safe." He wasn't pushing her away. He was building a bridge. He was giving her the one thing she had never been given by a man, the power. The rule of no was still in effect, now expanded to encompass not just their actions, but their hearts. The rain hammered the tin roof above them, a wild, rhythmic pulse. The wind howled, but on the porch, In the small, charged space between them, the world went quiet. They stood there, not speaking, just breathing, her hand on his shoulder, his eyes on hers. She could feel the steady, slow beat of his heart through the soles of her feet, a rhythm that seemed to rise from the very foundations of the house. The warmth of his body was a stark contrast to the cold, damp air, a living flame in the gray twilight. She was not afraid. For the first time, standing before a man, she felt not a flicker of fear, only a profound, terrifying, and exhilarating sense of rightness. She made the choice. Slowly, she lifted her other hand and laid it gently on his cheek. His skin was rough with a day's stubble, cool from the rain. He flinched, almost imperceptibly, a lifetime of holding back warring with the moment. But he didn't pull away. He closed his eyes, leaning into her touch as if it were the first kindness he had known in an age. She rose on her toes and pressed her lips to his. It was not a kiss of passion or of hunger. It was a kiss of profound, shattering tenderness. It was slow, soft, and questioning. It tasted of rain and dust and salt. It was an answer to an unasked question, a promise given in return for his. It was the sealing of a truce not just between them, but with their own ghosts. Cade's hands, which had been clenched at his sides, rose. One came to rest on her waist, a touch so light she could barely feel it, a gesture of steadying, not of possession. The other hand came up to cover hers on his cheek, his calloused fingers engulfing her own. They stood that way for a long, timeless moment, the storm raging around them, and a quiet, fragile peace blooming between them. When the kiss ended, it wasn't with a gasp or a sigh. They simply drew back, their foreheads resting together for a second, their breathing in sync. The storm in their hearts had found its calm center. Gradually, the fury of the wind began to subside. The drumming of the rain softened to a steady, lulling patter. The sky to the east began to lighten. The siege was over. They moved inside, into the deep, comforting gloom of the cabin. Cade built a fire in the hearth, the dry wood catching quickly, its cheerful crackle a welcome sound against the rain. The flames pushed the shadows back, filling the small room with a warm, golden light. He brought the heavy wool blanket from his cot, the one he had wrapped her in after the fight. He sat on the floor before the fire and, without a word, opened the blanket. It was an invitation. Laura sat beside him, and he draped the other half of the blanket over her shoulders. They sat there, wrapped in the shared warmth, watching the flames dance. They didn't talk about the kiss. They didn't talk about the future. Instead, they talked about the bright patches of the lost years. Laura told him about the county fairs of her childhood, the dizzying thrill of a carousel, the taste of spun sugar. Cade, his voice a low, hesitant rumble, told her about a scruffy, one-eyed dog he'd had as a boy, a dog who could track a rabbit for a mile and was terrified of chickens. They were small, simple stories, offerings of a life before the scars, before the fear. They were building a new foundation, not on the ruins of their pasts, but with the small, unbroken stones they had managed to salvage. The rain stopped, the fire burned low, the exhaustion of the day, of the kiss, of the confession, settled over them. "You should get some sleep," Cade said, his voice thick. "You too," she whispered. He stood and walked her to the cabin door. She looked toward the grain shed, her own small, safe room. He looked at his cot. The unspoken question hung in the warm, fire-lit air. The promise he had made on the porch held fast. It had to. "Good night, Laura," he said quietly. "Good night, Cade," she replied. She walked across the damp, clean-smelling yard under a sky now filled with a million brilliant stars. She slid the bar on her door. He went to his own bed. The pact was honored, the boundaries held, but in the quiet darkness of their separate rooms, neither of them slept for a very long time. Love, in this hard, unforgiving country, did not arrive like a lightning strike. It arrived like the rain after a storm, A slow, steady soaking that promised, against all odds, that something new might have a chance to grow. The morning after the storm, the world was raw and quiet. The air, washed clean of dust, was painfully clear. Every rock, every twisted branch of greasewood, stood out in sharp relief. It was a fragile peace, the kind that comes after a fever breaks. It was broken by the thunder of hooves. Cade and Laura were resetting a fence post loosened by the flash flood when they heard it. This wasn't one or two riders. It was a small army. They came not up the main path to the house, but across the open flat, making a direct line for the one thing that mattered more than the house, the barn, or the cattle. They were heading for Wellman Spring. Harlan Pike was in the lead, his face a mask of smug, drunken triumph. With him were 4 other men, hard-faced and carrying rifles with a casual ease that spoke of long, unpleasant practice. The San Mesa riders. They reined in their horses around the small, stone-lined well and the windmill that fed it, a clear act of occupation. "Stay here," Cade said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. He started for the house, his hand dropping to the butt of his pistol. "No," Laura said, her voice shaking but resolute. She grabbed his arm, her grip surprisingly strong. "We face them together in town. We face them together here. This is a fight for the ranch, Cade, not just for you." He looked at her, at the fierce determination in her eyes, and saw not a liability, but an ally. He gave a single, sharp nod. They walked out into the open, unarmed except for the pistol on Cade's hip. They stopped 100 feet from the well, a united front of 2 against 6. "Pike," Cade's voice was like a whip crack in the still air. "You're trespassing." Harlan laughed, a loud, ugly sound. He swung down from his horse, swaggering. "Am I, boss? Seems to me I'm just visiting my own property, my wife's property, which makes it my property." He gestured expansively at the land. "I'm here to claim what's mine, starting with the water." "She is not your wife," Cade stated, his voice flat and cold. "And this is not your land." "Is that so?" Harlan sneered. "I got a signed paper says otherwise. Signed by the deacon himself, and I got witnesses. A whole town full of 'em, ready to swear Silas Kern gave her to me." It was then that a new sound began, a low rumble from the main trail. Another cloud of dust was rising, but this one was larger, slower, more deliberate. Harlan grinned. "See, here comes the rest of the town now, to back me up." But as the riders came into view, Harlan's grin faltered. At the head of the group was Marshal Bram Holloway. Beside him rode a stern-faced man in a black coat, a circuit judge named Elias Thorne, known for his harsh sentences and his intolerance for fools. And behind them were not just Pike's cronies, but a dozen citizens of Juniper Flats. Dr. Ada Merriweather was there, her medical bag in hand. Mabel Crow from the Copper Lily sat on the seat of her buckboard, her face a mask of grim satisfaction. They were not a mob, they were a jury. Bram rode forward, his horse stopping between the 2 groups. The air was stretched so tight it felt like it might snap. "Harlan," Bram said, his voice heavy with weary authority, "you're creating a public disturbance." "I'm claiming my rights," Pike bellowed, emboldened by the presence of the San Mesa riders. "This woman belongs to me." "That," Judge Thorne said, his voice cutting through the tension like a razor, "is a matter for the law to decide, not for armed men." He looked at the scene, his eyes missing nothing. "It seems the court has come to the complaint. We'll settle this here. Now." It was a trial in the red dust. "Dr. Merriweather," the judge said, "you have a statement." Ada stepped forward, her demeanor calm and professional. She held up a single sheet of paper. "I do, Your Honor. I have here a medical report, detailing the injuries Ms. Laura Benton presented with upon her arrival in this territory. Rope burns on both wrists, consistent with being bound against her will. Lacerations and contusions on her feet, consistent with a long flight over rough terrain, and subsequent injuries sustained while defending Mr. Voss's property." She looked directly at Pike. These are not the injuries of a willing bride. A low murmur went through the assembled townspeople. Mabel Crow, the judge continued, you have evidence to present. Mabel climbed down from her buckboard, holding a thick, grease-stained ledger. I do, Your Honor. She opened the book on the buckboard seat. This is Silas Kern's debt ledger. He left it at my saloon in his haste to drink away his profits. I call your attention to the final entry. Her finger, surprisingly delicate, pointed to a line. It says, for clearance of all outstanding debts, one girl, L.B. He didn't even use her name. He traded her like a sack of beans. The murmur grew louder. Silas Kern, who had been hiding at the back of Pike's group, began to edge away, his face pale with sweat. And what do you have to say? Ms. Benton, Judge Thorne asked, his gaze settling on Laura. This was her moment. All eyes were on her. She stepped forward, leaving Cade's side, standing alone in the space between the factions. Her voice, when she spoke, did not tremble. It was clear, and it was strong. My name is Laura Benton, she began. I am not L.B. I am not a debt to be paid. I am not a piece of property to be traded for a poker hand. She looked from Harlan's furious face to the judge's stern one. There was no marriage. There was only a business transaction that I was not a part of. I was tied to a chair while my future was sold. She turned, and her gaze swept over the faces of the townspeople, the people who had whispered about her. I ran from that. I came to Kestrel Ridge seeking shelter, and I found a home. I am not being held here. I am not a prisoner. She took a deep breath, and her final words rang out over the silent yard. I choose this place, and I choose to stand with the man who defends it. The statement was absolute. It was a declaration of will, an act of self-ownership that no forged document could refute. Silas Kern saw his last hope vanish. He turned to flee, but Bram was waiting. The marshal's hand clamped down on his shoulder like a vice. You're not going anywhere, Silas. Harlan Pike's face was purple with rage. I have a signed paper, a marriage witness, Deacon Tolliver, he shrieked, his voice cracking. Judge Thorne's cold eyes found the deacon in the crowd. Deacon, did you witness a legal marriage ceremony between this man and this woman? Deacon Tolliver squirmed, his face slick with sweat. He looked at the angry faces of the San Mesa riders, and then at the unyielding face of the judge. He chose the law. No, Your Honor, he stammered. The paper. Harlan Pike pressured me to sign it. He said it was just a formality. There was no ceremony. Laura Benton wasn't even present. The last pillar of Harlan's claim had crumbled into dust. Cade stepped forward, holding out the papers Laura had prepared. Your Honor, this is the legal deed to Kestrel Ridge and the Wellman Spring, with newly marked and witnessed boundaries, co-signed by Marshal Holloway. Judge Thorne's verdict was swift and brutal. Harlan Pike, your claim is fraudulent and dismissed. Silas Kern, he said, his voice like ice as he looked at the trembling man in Bram's grip. You are under arrest for the crime of attempted human trafficking. The world seemed to explode. Harlan Pike, robbed of his prize, his authority, and his dignity, let out a roar of pure animalistic fury. He lunged, not at the judge, not at the marshal, but at the source of his humiliation, Cade. It was a wild, desperate charge. Cade didn't draw his gun. He didn't even take a step back. As Pike came at him, he moved with a fluid, economical grace. He sidestepped the clumsy attack, caught Pike's lunging arm, twisted, and used the man's own momentum to slam him face first into the dirt. In one smooth motion, he had Pike's arm wrenched behind his back in a painful, immobilizing lock. It was over in 2 seconds. It was a clean, professional, an utterly decisive act of control, not violence. He hauled the sputtering, winded Pike to his feet and shoved him toward the marshal. He's all yours. Bram? The San Mesa riders watched it all. They saw their employer arrested. They saw their enforcer humiliated without a single shot fired. They were not loyalists. They were mercenaries. Their contract was broken, silently, as one. They turned their horses and simply rode away, melting back into the landscape. A profound, stunned silence fell over the yard. The tension that had been stretched to the breaking point snapped, and the release was palpable. Then, a sound. A single person began to clap. It was Mabel Crow. Then Ada Merriweather joined in. Soon, a scattered, hesitant applause spread through the crowd of townspeople. It wasn't a cheer. It was the sound of a fever breaking, the sound of rain falling after a long, brutal drought. Laura's gaze was fixed on Cade. He stood, calm and solid, in the center of the yard, the dust settling around him. He hadn't been her champion. He hadn't been her savior, riding in to rescue the damsel. He had been her partner. She looked at him, and he met her gaze. In his eyes, she saw not a victor, but a man who was, for the first time, not standing alone. They had fought, and they had won, not as a rancher and a refugee, but as a team. The last of the wagons and riders disappeared down the trail, a receding cloud of dust that was slowly absorbed by the immense, quiet landscape. The trial was over. The verdict had been rendered not just by the judge, but by the land itself. The afternoon sun, low and heavy in the sky, bled across the horizon, staining the clouds in hues of deep crimson and fiery orange. The light that fell on Kestrel Ridge was warm and thick, like honey, turning the pale dust to gold and the dark wood of the cabin to the color of glowing embers. The windmill, its heart repaired, turned slowly in the gentle breeze, its familiar, rhythmic creak. Creak? Creak no longer a sound of lonely labor, but the steady, reassuring heartbeat of a hard-won, legal freedom. Marshal Bram Holloway was the last to leave. He sat on his horse, looking at the two figures standing on the porch, a long, weary expression on his face. He swung down, walked over to the porch railing, and unpinned the tin star from his chest. He held it in the palm of his calloused hand, the metal warm from the sun. "You know," he said, his voice a low rumble, "most days, this star feels heavy. It's about corralling drunks and settling disputes over fences. But today?" He looked from Cade to Laura, his gaze filled with a deep, grudging respect. Today wasn't about the law. Today was about ordinary folks doing the right thing, even when it was the hard thing. He pinned the star back on his vest, the simple action a reaffirmation of his duty. The town owes you both a debt. He tipped his hat, a gesture that was more than just a farewell. It was an acknowledgement of equals. He mounted his horse and rode away, a solitary figure of order, leaving the quiet to settle back over the ranch. Just as the peace began to feel real, Mabel Crow's buckboard rattled up the path. She pulled to a stop, her sharp eyes taking in the scene: the repaired windmill, the quiet cattle, the two figures standing close but not touching. She climbed down, holding a small, neatly folded parcel of white linen. She handed it to Laura. "Every good worker deserves a clean apron," she said, her voice brisk, businesslike. It was the one she had been wearing in town, now washed and pressed. "Things are going to be different in Juniper Flats. Quieter, more respectable." She gave Laura a shrewd, assessing look. "When you're ready, you come see me. The Copper Lily could use a decent coffee counter. Run it yourself. Keep your own profits, your own place." It was a generous offer. It was a path, a way back to an independent life, beholden to no one. It was everything Laura might have once dreamed of. Laura took the apron, the clean linen cool and smooth in her hands. She looked at the sturdy cabin behind her, at the vast open land that stretched to the mesas. She looked at Cade. A slow, genuine smile touched her lips. "Thank you, Mabel. It's a kind offer." She folded the apron neatly. "But I think I already have a place to brew my coffee." Mabel Crow's sharp face softened. She saw the truth in Laura's eyes. She nodded once, a woman who understood when a bargain had been struck that had nothing to do with money. "I figured as much," she said. She climbed back onto her buckboard and, with a snap of the reins, drove away, leaving them finally, truly, alone. The silence that remained was different. It was not empty. It was full of unspoken things, of shared history, of a future that was a vast, uncharted territory. Cade turned and walked to the well, his movements slow, deliberate. The chain for the bucket had been strained in the attack. One of the links bent. He picked up a hammer, his focus narrowing to the simple, physical task. Work was his language. He hammered the link, the sharp clang of steel on steel echoing in the quiet air. Laura walked over and stood beside him. He finished the repair, his hand resting on the heavy wooden lever that drew the water up. She reached out and laid her hand over his. Her hand was smaller, softer, but it was not weak. It was a hand that had learned to tie knots, to fire a rifle, to bake bread, to alter a shirt. His hand was larger, scarred, and calloused. A hand that had known war and 5 years of solitary labor. Together, they covered the lever. It was not a caress, it was a commitment. Slowly, together, they pushed the lever down. The bucket descended into the cool, dark earth. The action was simple, functional. It was a promise to draw life from this land, together. It was a silent vow. Laura looked at their joined hands, then up at his face, his profile etched against the blazing sunset. Her voice was a whisper, a secret shared in the vastness of the open air. "You showed me why you were alone, Cade." He turned his head, his pale gray eyes searching hers. "It wasn't because you were broken," she continued, her voice soft but certain. "It was because you were saving the best part of yourself, the quiet part, the kind part. You were keeping it safe, for someone who deserved it." A muscle worked in his jaw. He looked away from her, his gaze sweeping across the horizon, across the land that had been his only companion for so long. The setting sun lit the lines on his face, the map of his solitude. "And you," he said, his voice a low, rough murmur that seemed to rise from the earth itself. "You showed me that being alone is just a temporary thing." He finally looked back at her, and the guarded walls in his eyes were gone, replaced by a raw, profound vulnerability. "It's just temporary, when someone finally dares to stay." The words hung between them, a truth as solid and real as the ground beneath their feet. He had named her courage. She had named his worth. Slowly, deliberately, he shrugged out of the heavy sheepskin coat he wore, the one that was his armor against the cold and the world. It was not a grand gesture. It was a quiet, practical act, like everything he did. He turned and draped the coat over Laura's shoulders. It was heavy, enveloping her in its warmth. It smelled of him, of leather, wood smoke, and the clean scent of the high desert. It was not a gift. It was a sharing. He was wrapping her in his life, his home, his destiny. As the coat settled on her shoulders, a single, clear, metallic note rang out from the cabin. Clang. It was the small brass handbell. A gust of wind through the open door must have nudged it on the table. It was not the frantic, desperate ringing of an alarm. It was one clear, solitary chime, a signal that was no longer about danger, but about a shared, private language. A signal that meant, all is clear. A signal that meant, I'm coming in. He stepped closer, his hands coming to rest on her shoulders, over his own coat. He drew her in. She went without hesitation, her hands finding their place on his chest, over the steady, solid beat of his heart. They stood on the porch, wrapped in the last, brilliant fire of the sunset, the golden light catching in her hair, turning it to a halo. He lowered his head, and she lifted hers. The kiss was not the tentative, questioning kiss of the storm. It was certain. It was a kiss of arrival, of homecoming. It held all the quiet understanding of the days of shared labor, all the fierce loyalty of the battles they had won, all the tender hope of the confessions whispered in the dark. It was gentle. It was respectful. It was a promise, made in the twilight, at the border between the long, dark night of their pasts and the bright, unknown morning of their future. And all around them, the vast, silent landscape of Juniper Flats, which had witnessed so much hardship and so much strife, held its breath. It bore witness to the two solitary figures on the porch, now one silhouette against the dying sun, and it seemed to offer its silent, solemn acknowledgement from this day forward. They were no longer alone. Thank you so much for listening to our story. We'd love to know where you're listening from. So please drop a comment below to say hello and share your thoughts. If you enjoyed this tale, please subscribe to our channel. Wild West Stories, 1850. Give this video a like and consider hitting the hype button to help this story be heard by more people.